Hey, everybody, this is Jake Wynn, public historian, along with my co host, Justin Voithofer, back for another episode recap of Masters of the Air, this time for episode 6. We are joined this evening by Dan Vermilya, who is a historian and author who works for the National Park Service at Eisenhower National Historic Site. Dan, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Excellent. So, with these episodes, we have been recapping each of the episodes of the miniseries Masters of the Air, airing on Apple TV Plus this winter and into spring. I don't know how long this goes through the winter of 2024. And so we are on to episode 6. In these episodes, we just kind of recap what we've seen, talk about some of the history behind these episodes. And give some reaction to what we've been watching. So you can go back and find our previous episodes on both YouTube and Facebook. And so I'm going to dive right into a quick recap of the episode before we really get into the meat of what we want to talk about here. And I know Dan has some great things that he wants to touch on in our episode this evening. So quick recap here, very quick. I'm going to try my best to do this quickly. We see the aftermath from episode 5. Of the shoot down of Major Egan. We see him hitting the ground, post hitting the ground in this episode, and ultimately his capture. Some harrowing scenes of the violence against down flyers. This was a increasingly persistent problem for downed airmen as the war goes on, as more and more of Germany looks like what we see in this episode, burned out, bombed out cities with civilians trying to put the pieces back together. We see our friend Crosby going off to Oxford and meeting up with Sandra, or Landra, as we'll talk about a little bit later. And we also see our friend, Justin's favorite, Rosie, going to a Flak House. And trying to get some relaxation after an awful 3 missions. Something notable about this episode is that we don't see any missions, so we're not up in the air. We're seeing these folks on the ground, both in Germany as a prisoner and on the ground in England in various rural and beautiful spaces in England, either country estate where we see in the Flak House or at Oxford University. We see some German interrogation tactics in this episode, a little bit creepy, just how much the Germans know about the downed American flyers and the units that are serving still back in England. We also see notably in this episode some airmen seeing the Holocaust in practice, seeing as men are being loaded onto trains to go to a POW camp, of seeing other trains, cattle cars filled with human beings, just trying to get some air out of the windows, something that we will discuss a little bit in this episode as well. And finally, we see some the great reuniting of Buck and Bucky in the prisoner of war camp, pretty dramatic scenes there. So that's basically a quick, very not so efficient overview of the episode. But let's dive into to talk about some reactions. So I'm going to hand it over to Justin here, and then I think we're going to hand it over to Dan.
Well, I was going to say I don't have much. You covered all of it. I think we did the show sheet before, and I'm just going to get out of the way and let you guys talk about it, because everything I wanted to talk about, you guys already hit. I think the biggest thing is that this episode kind of hit harder than I expected it to. And this is the first, personally, and there may be something out there, maybe you guys can speak to it. I've not seen this side of the war, right? You've not seen the POW experience like this, where they're being escorted through Germany to the POW camp. Everything, I think we mentioned last episode, Jake, that I know of POW experiences in the ETO revolves around the Great Escape and that kind of stuff, the romantic kind of notion of escaping and getting out of German captivity. But you don't see this experience all too much. Then you also compare and contrast it with the other shot down folks we talked about, episode 3, I think 2 or 3, who landed in Belgium, and the comparing and contrasting between the two of them. Their experiences are very different whether you land in Belgium, France, or in Germany. But without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Dan. Dan, what did you think of the episode so far?
No, I think That's an interesting comment you make there, because we see numbers, tens of thousands of casualties for the Eighth Army Air Force. They're all having different experiences. Some are killed outright in the crashes. Some are POWs. Some are escaping, making their way back, go on to have more of a war experience going on. I thought episode 6 was a masterpiece. I really did. This was my favorite so far. I think. Look, miniseries like this are aimed at telling these stories on a broad level. And that means that sometimes, in order to get these things into an episodic narrative, you have to do a little bit here or there, play with some timing of things. But it was really masterful at getting at some of the, like you said, the harder side of this. There wasn't a mission, but I thought even without one, it was still very intense. You have the scenes of the American POWs coming through a German town. You had several major characters having their own moment where they're realizing why this is all going on, or they already realize it, but this is hitting home in new ways. It's hard not to compare this to its predecessors with the production of it and the names involved, but I've thought that this is actually a moment where there's a fair comparison to Band of Brothers, with episode 9 of that, in the Holocaust concentration camp liberation episode. You saw a different version of that with Crosby being told, the only reason anyone dies in this war is Hitler and his thugs. You saw Rosenthal make the comment about, if you see people being persecuted, what are you supposed to do? You see Egan, that shot of him seeing the cattle cars as by fall of 43, the final solution is escalating further. It's just all these moments along the way that remind you that this isn't just counting rivets and B-17s. This is a real thing that happened with some consequences. And I think also, there's been some complaining about the lack of character development in the series, but one thing that this does very well at is developing characters and getting to know these guys as you go. And one thing that has struck me is the use of music. The score, the soundtrack is beautiful. It's powerful. It's what you'd expect from a Hank Spielberg World War II epic. But the use of music in this one, I think, is really makes it different and exceptional in some new ways. The including of the Woody Guthrie song "Tear the Fascists Down," with that sequence there, that was I think that was, for me, the shot of the series so far. Even with all the other powerful things. And in that previous episode, you had seen the shot of Rosenthal, who, from what I understand, in his personal life, was someone who was very passionate about music. Him humming on the plane when they're alone in the sky to keep the guys at ease. And he kind of picks back up with this comment to the doctor at the Flak House about, you don't interrupt a great Gene Krupa drum solo. You let him keep going. You let him stay in the rhythm. And then at the very end of the episode, when he gets back in the plane, what do you hear but the same song that he was humming? So I thought that was really just really, really well done. The acting in the series is phenomenal. The score is phenomenal, but that's quality writing right there, I think. So I thought it was really good at capturing a lot of historical truth and still delivering it in a way that it really hits home. And one of my metrics for the series is it not just reaching me, or is it reaching others? And I'm having conversations with my wife about B-17 planes, and I think the music, and she was very moved by some of that as well. So I thought it was very well done.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
I would echo something about, you mentioned, Dan, about talking about kind of the character development. And that's, in earlier episodes, that's something that we talked about, where we were kind of blasting through missions and we weren't really getting to know any of these characters very well in those earlier episodes. I will say that I've come around on this, and I've been thinking about the way that this series is developing characters, and the way that this way this miniseries is being consumed, that is different from past miniseries in this trilogy, if you will. Whereas this is the first time that it's coming direct to streaming, and the idea of going back and rewatching a series over again as we now do with Band of Brothers or the Pacific, where we can go back and we can kind of watch over and over and over again in a way that when Band of Brothers and the Pacific were made strictly for television to be consumed on a weekly basis, and then you would not see the series in its entirety until you bought a DVD box set months or years later. And so it's like this show, almost from the offing, I've come to, as I'm going back and rewatching episodes, realizing that, yeah, I think this is something that they may have been taking into account as they're making it, that this is something that people can consume very quickly, go back and watch it again, so they can really put more into it, by making things happen faster, by developing things, storylines take place, everything is shot more quickly. You see things more quickly. Scenes are shorter, and we're seeing more of a time frame here. Things are happening in a more condensed space, and I'm wondering if that's because of the nature of how we are consuming this media at this point. So, and I will say, going back and rewatching now, you see these characters, and you can see that character development actually is there. You have to be knowing what you're looking for. You have to, later developments help to kind of bring that out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think just there's an element of this with the high casualty rates that some characters you're not getting to know, because in the reality of it, that's how it was at these bases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. We see that kind of reminiscent of, in a different way, of in Band of Brothers with replacements, people not getting to know them, because what's the point? They're going to be gone in one mission or two missions or three missions. And I know in Masters of the Air and any of these memoirs written by these guys, they talk about, you didn't want to necessarily get to know people because they could be gone at any point. So I think that's a really great point as well. Just a couple other things I want to highlight here. I think that the way that they acknowledged the consequences of the Nazi war machine in this episode were brilliant. I know, Dan, you touched on that too, kind of talking about it in different ways. And I think that the how do you say, subaltern Westgate, her kind of the British perspective on this, which is they've been going through this since 1939, and really since the Blitz in 1940. They have this down to kind of the bare bones of it. They understand they have a better grasp than their American counterparts, having lived under Nazi bombing since 1940. They have a better grasp of what this is all about and why people are dying. And I thought that was a particularly poignant way of acknowledging that fact. But I think that the trains that we see in this, the way that Germans brutally moved people around, whether they be POWs like we see with Egan and his fellow prisoners being ushered very violently into their own cattle cars, and then seeing the civilians, the women and children, families being moved around in the other trains that they witnessed. I thought that those scenes were particularly poignant. And I think overall, this kind of combination of all of these different storylines that we see in this episode, I would agree that this is top 2 episode for me, I think, of the series so far, in part because we are getting to see these individuals as well, and how they are perceiving the world around them and the events around them. But with that, we kind of roll into some more of the kind of history behind this particular episode. And Dan, I know you have some thoughts about this, some of the history behind this, so I'll toss it over to you.
Yeah, I thought, you just mentioned Egan, the scene of him and the other American POWs coming through a German town. To my understanding, I don't know that it specifically happened to him, but things like that did happen. They are documented. Especially there was one more well-known in August of 44 in Rüsselsheim, if I'm saying that correctly, Germany, where they're having to switch rail lines and get POWs to a different rail line and going through a town, and they essentially get massacred. Part of this strategic bombing for the Americans was, I think, the sense that it was above board, that we're aiming at targets that are strategic value. We're aiming at U-boat pens, at ball bearing factories, by the fall of 43, you begin to see, like with the Munster raid, the target really was German railroad workers themselves. And of course, as you go into 44 and early 45, you have things like the famous, well-known firebombing of Dresden. It's a brutal reality, and hundreds of thousands of Germans were killed by these bombs. I thought the way they did that scene, very strong parallels to the scene a couple episodes earlier with Egan walking in London. Almost the same shot, right?
Yeah.
We seeing a mother mourning her child being lost. There's destroyed buildings. So each one shows that there's both sides of this suffering from these bombing missions. So I thought that was very, very well done. Even they were clearly trying to get that scene in there, or some truth to that effect. I thought also with the Crosby scenes in Oxford were very, very powerful as well. He didn't go to Oxford for that conference until February of 44. And he writes about it extensively at his memoir, Wing and a Prayer, which highly, highly recommend. But it was good timing to talk about the impact that the death of Captain Bubbles Payne had on him, even though he actually didn't die until April of 44, and he's actually buried at the Normandy American Cemetery. But I think tying it in with Rosenthal and with Egan, this was a very effective way of conveying the meaning of all of this and the impact of all of this on Crosby. And even the relationship he has with subaltern Wingate, who they kind of slightly altered her name a little bit from Alessandra. Her actual name was Alexandra, which she shortened to Landra. If you read Crosby's memoir, he writes of her as a close friend, and that he's going through this tremendously profound and traumatic experience, and his wife is an ocean away. So it's a friendship that he's developing. And some of the dialogue, even though they slightly altered her name, some of the dialogue is pulled directly from Crosby's memoir. So even the times where they're playing with the timelines a little bit to fit things into these episodes, they're going to tremendous lengths to still make sure that they're getting the actual history of this correct, which I think is very, very well done. I think, including the flak houses, that was a very important thing for these bomber boys, because not only was this a new form of warfare, but we didn't understand the psychological impact of this on them at all. And that's being studied, and they're trying to figure that out. And some of these guys came back and were so traumatized that they're injecting them with chemicals in darkened rooms to get them to talk about their experiences. And they're trying all of these things because the PTSD they're suffering is very different than the ground war. In the ground war, it's a day-to-day grind. You're not coming back and having drinks at the base with dancing and going to the local pub, or going to, read of Mice and Men while you see guys playing in a country estate. Very, very different things. Very different things. So, and also just the interrogation scene of Egan was tremendous. I, for one, am glad that Egan's love of baseball is just woven throughout the series, because I too love baseball. So I thought that was wonderful to have that included there. But Buck and Bucky were shot down, I mean, just 2 days apart. And they were actually at that interrogation camp at the same time. They just didn't know it. And then Buck ended up getting to Stalag Luft 3 a couple days before Bucky did. So it's clear that their friendship is the heart of the series, and them being in the camp together is gonna, I think, open up some tremendous storytelling opportunities for talking about that POW experience.
Yeah, and the one thing, so Dan, you might be able to speak on this. Jake and I were kind of kicking back and forth. The thing I think we need to also think about when we have the scene of them standing in the rail yard and seeing the train come through with the women and children inside of it. This is October of 43. We know that as the Holocaust, but for them, there's not, and we kept going back and forth on when the reports start coming out of what this looks like and what's going on in Germany, because it's not right away. So it's one, to get a sense of, they also don't know what that is. This is the first time they'll get, much like you said with Why We Fight, when Winters comes up and sees the camp and there's that kind of, oh my gosh, what is this sort of thing? It was, I don't know if it was rushed, but they had other things to do in the episode. But I just want to point out that is something that we got to think about too, is that these guys, they don't know that is the Holocaust. They don't know what's going on there. They see that for the first time.
Yeah, and that's really important. I mean, the persecution of Jews and peoples in Europe is very well known, and there's a couple references to that. But I think by and large, a lot of American servicemen were caught entirely off guard by what they saw. And why wouldn't you be? I mean, how would you know that people are capable of doing that to other people until you see it yourself?
Right.
Even Eisenhower was absolutely floored by what he saw when he got to the Ordorf concentration camp in April of 45. I think arguably one of the 5 most influential things Eisenhower did in his life was making sure that the Holocaust was documented. And the letters and the things that he's sending back to the United States are like, you're not going to believe what's going on here. So yeah, that scene of Egan looking at it and just having this difficulty processing what he's seeing, but then having to jump right back into, hey, a guy just got shot, we got to get on this train and go. I think that rang very true.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do wonder too. I don't know if Dan, if you've been listening to the companion podcast from the World War II Museum, but the most recent episode, Donald Miller talks about this topic about interactions between these POWs and victims of the Holocaust. And so I wonder if we will see this again with kind of the later stages of the war, with the marches, the death marches, as the Nazi empire kind of collapses in on itself, and prisoners and displaced people are all being moved all over the place, and they interact. There's some interactions there. So I'm wondering if this won't be the last time that we encounter this as a theme in this particular episode. And I'm very curious to see if and how they kind of wind that story together as we see the very violent end stages of the Nazi regime in this show, which the trailer kind of alludes to. We're going to see some of that in ultimately in the end.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because as obviously it's for future episodes, but as the, like you said, as the Third Reich collapses, that means a lot of things for a lot of different people who are caught in all of this.
So we'll pivot over to kind of some more of your thoughts. This is every guest we've been bringing into these recaps. We always like to ask, just a kind of generally overview of the series, what your thoughts are about Masters of the Air. You have the benefit, unlike our other guests, of having seen 6 episodes, so there's more there to see. But very curious about about the series so far, and also what it's going to do for kind of the how Americans interact with the memory of the Second World War too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very blown away by the series, and it's tough to say that for something that has been in development for over 10 years. And you hear a lot of folks in the history world say, "Oh, I've been waiting on this for years," and I'm one of them. A lot of us are. It's everything I hoped it would be, and by that I mean a couple different things. I hoped it would be different from its predecessors. I don't need another Band of Brothers. One exists. It's spectacular. I'm great with that. I'm not as harsh on the Pacific as others are. I thought the Pacific tried to be its own thing, and it stumbled in some ways, but the Pacific War was so different. But I really like that this tries to just establish itself in its own way. I know Apple doesn't really release their data for viewership. They're kind of secretive about that, but I did see that this is its most streamed series ever. That the first 2 episodes were watched more times than entire seasons of other shows have been. So I have a feeling that this is a big deal. Hopefully generating cultural interest in this. Even looking at like the iTunes charts, you see Artie Shaw songs on there, and you see the cover of Tear the Fascist Down tracking on there, and both of which were prominent in the last couple episodes. So hopefully people are noticing it and being able to really connect with it. Doing what we do with public history, it is about obviously getting the history right, but how are you effectively telling these stories? And I know for us at Eisenhower, we're trying to as we look to what we do as a site, how we interpret the Second World War. It's a big year for us. It's the 80th anniversary of D-Day. And part of what we're doing is trying to craft this around this idea of the Great Crusade, how it's not just one day, it's a broader thing. And I think that this reminds us that the air war was part of that. Here in Gettysburg, we have over 500 World War II casualties buried in Gettysburg National Cemetery. A number of them are air war casualties. We're hoping that, we can do more interpretation talking about those stories, and that there'll be an interest in those stories because of a series like this. Really, it's just anytime people are thinking about the past in these ways and connecting with it in an emotional way, it helps to land differently, I think. And this series seems to be doing that. And also for me, it's just the one thing I think about a lot is, Eisenhower talked about D-Day as this great crusade, but what does that mean more broadly for World War II? And I'd say this series is intensely relevant for the world that we live in today. And that's one of the many reasons I say it's everything I hoped it would be. And I think that's especially true with episode 6. It reminds us of this time that there were all these people from all across the country and all across the world in this common cause. And it does so with some pretty good writing and acting and a good score as well. So I'm very pleased with it, and I'm optimistic that it's well timed and it'll be well received and help to increase interest in one of our nation's even most popular eras of history, but still continue to increase interest in some of these stories that haven't been well known before.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Dan. Justin, what are you thinking?
You got my episode by episode kind of, I don't know if you want to say critique, but reaction to it. I was pleased because I thought that the next episode we'd be transitioning to what we see in the trailer, which is Tuskegee Airmen and then kind of their kind of viewpoint of it. But looking at the previews for it, it sounds like we're going to stay right in the camps and right with the POW kind of experience, which I'm fine with. Once again, as I said before, I have not, this is new territory for me. This is something that I am looking forward to. I trust that they're going to do it right. I know that they're going to do it right. So I'm kind of interested to see how the next kind of episode ties in. And kind of when we put a cap on the story of the 100th and then shift to what we see in the trailer. That's just something I'm kind of interested in and interested to see how they kind of incorporate that other story into it too. But how about you, Jake?
Yeah, no, I think that this was one of the most outstanding episodes so far, as we've already discussed. I will say, as we were talking, as Dan's talking a little bit about the Eisenhower site where he works. This, I think, is our first Eisenhower reference in this episode of the whole series of the
it was noted
line.
It was noted.
Which for the, I assume everyone's watched it. If not, spoiler alert, it's the underpaid, undersexed, and under Eisenhower, being the talking about the British. But I would say, jokes aside, I think Dan, I think you summed things up so well in contextualizing this whole series in the frame of public history and why this matters, and what this can do for historic sites like the Eisenhower National Historic Site, and others that tell this World War II story, especially as we're celebrating and commemorating this year the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and as we close out, and we're losing the last of our veterans as well, and so these kinds of stories are going to be the way that future generations are going to be having interactions with these stories, is going to be through these mediums. So we're at kind of that, Band of Brothers was that amazing in part because it had those veterans interviews in it, and those are going to be increasingly difficult to get, if not impossible to get, once we lose our final veterans. So it's this kind of story that is going to be keeping this memory alive. And I think this is doing a really, really great job of taking, as we talked about so much, Crosby's memoir, and taking quotes and taking it and putting it onto the screen. I think that's going to be a testament to the devotion, to the history that the creators of this show are really putting into it. And I'm glad to see that that's been continuing over 6 episodes, and I have every faith that that's going to continue on through the remainder of the series as well. So, all right, we are just about out of time here. So, Dan, I just want to say a huge thank you for coming on this evening and sharing your expertise, and really appreciate you being here to share that with us.
Well, thank you for having me. Thanks, guys.
All right, and thank you all out there for tuning in. Please drop some comments in if you have any thoughts about this episode, thoughts about the way we discussed this episode. And it was great to see that viewership continues to tick up on these as we continue to produce them. So that's great. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Justin and I are very appreciative that people are enjoying these conversations. We're enjoying having these conversations.
I was going to say, I think we've talked about it, right, Jake, that we would do this if no one watched. So I'm glad somebody else is humoring us, I guess.
Absolutely. And it brings us great opportunities to have wonderful conversations with fellow public historians like Dan. So
yeah, I know, it's perfect.
Yep. So, well, thank you guys all so much for watching, and we will see you for the next episode next week. And thank you so much for tuning in.